Imagine a resource so potent that a single acre could outperform 10 tons of industrial chemicals. During World War II, families who grew this plant didn't just save money, they stepped out of the system entirely. No fertilizer for a season, no fertilizer for a decade. They had discovered a biological engine that didn't just feed the soil, once it initiated a perpetual cycle of fertility. March 1942. Wales. A farmer named Thomas Edwards stood over a patch of gray, exhausted earth. Years of wartime demands had stripped his garden of every nutrient. Fertilizer was non-existent, diverted to the front lines to make explosives. He planted a specific forgotten strain of white clover. By autumn, the nitrogen levels in his soil hadn't just recovered, they had doubled. By the following spring, they tripled. For 3 years, Edwards grew heavy feeders, tomatoes, beans, and cabbage, without adding a single ounce of outside input. The plant worked while he slept, pulling nitrogen from the very air and injecting it into the root zone through a silent symbiotic dance with soil bacteria. By 1944, this wasn't a secret. It was a movement. Over 70% of British victory gardens were powered by this living fertilizer. Depleted plots exploded into life. Families were no longer dependent on a supply chain that had collapsed. Then the war ended, and the factories that manufactured TNT for bombs found themselves with a massive surplus of ammonium nitrate. They didn't need to feed the world. They needed to sell a byproduct. Within 10 years, the Forever Plant was scrubbed from agricultural manuals. Extension offices went silent. Seed catalogs replaced the clover with colorful bags of chemicals. The logic was simple. You cannot sell a product to someone who grows their own for free. You cannot create a customer for life when a single planting provides fertility for generations. A $200 billion industry was built on the deliberate erasure of what your grandparents knew. They traded your independence for a subscription model, but the records survived. The Edwards journals, the wartime surveys, the forgotten archives, they're all still here. To reclaim this, you need to understand the nitrogen protocol. It isn't complex, but it is precise. First, you must look for trifolium repens, specifically the large-leafed Ladino varieties used in the 1940s. Second, the timing is critical. Sow into a cooling soil to allow the root nodules to establish before the heavy feeders take over. Third, and most importantly, you must stop the tilling. When you turn the soil, you burn the nitrogen. Instead, you mow the clover back, letting the clippings act as a slow-release nitrogen bomb. This is the information they spent decades burying. Methods that make you independent of the global supply chain. This isn't just gardening. It's a quiet rebellion against a system designed to keep you buying. If you're ready to stop being a consumer and start being a producer, hit subscribe. We're digging up the knowledge they tried to kill. Share this. Because the one thing a billion-dollar industry fears most is a farmer who doesn't need them. After the smoke cleared in 1945, the factories didn't stop. The giant machines that manufactured explosives for World War II simply changed their target. They turned their chemical fires toward the soil. They sold us a lie that life could only grow from a bag. That fertility was something you had to buy every year forever. But Thomas Edwards remembered a different story. A story his grandfather whispered about a plant that didn't take. It gave. He found the seeds in a dust-covered shed. White clover. Trifolium repens. To the modern chemical industry, it's a weed. To the earth, it's an engine. In March, Thomas scattered these tiny seeds between his rows of vegetables. He didn't plow. He didn't spray. He just let them wake up. Within 3 weeks, a silent green carpet claimed the bare earth. It wasn't competing with his tomatoes. It was feeding them. By midsummer, the transformation was undeniable. While the neighbors' gardens started to yellow and fade, Thomas's soil was vibrating with life. Deep dark green leaves, stalks that refused to bend. Underground, a biological alchemy was at work. Attached to the clover's roots were tiny white nodules. These are the homes of rhizobium-specialized bacteria that do what no human factory can. They breathe in the nitrogen gas from the atmosphere, the 78% of the air we usually can't touch, and they turn it into liquid gold for the soil. Free fertilizer, manufactured 24 hours a day. While the farmer sleeps, the numbers are staggering. A single acre of this weed can fix up to 300 pounds of nitrogen in a single season. Thomas's garden only needed half of that. The clover was over-delivering, flooding the soil with more nutrients than his vegetables could even consume. This is why the billion-dollar industries panicked. You cannot sell a solution to a man who has already solved the problem for free. If you want to reclaim your soil, follow the protocol. First, source raw white clover seeds. Avoid the treated varieties. Second, sow them in early spring or late autumn directly into the gaps between your main crops. Third, let it grow. When the clover gets too tall, simply mow it or chop it back. As the clippings decay, they release a massive burst of nitrogen. As the roots die back, they leave tunnels of fertility deep in the earth. Thomas didn't buy a single bag of fertilizer the next year. He didn't have to. White clover is a perennial. It is a permanent nitrogen factory that returns every spring stronger and more aggressive than the year before. His tomato yield jumped by 42%. His cabbage doubled in size. He had broken the cycle of dependency. Nature doesn't have a shortage of nutrients. It only has a shortage of people brave enough to remember how the world actually works. The inputs they want you to buy are temporary. The clover is forever, 19 parts per million. That was the nitrogen level in Thomas Edwards' soil when he started. 3 years later, 78. A 400% increase in fertility, without a single bag of store-bought chemicals. While the rest of the world was beginning to pay for synthetic inputs, Thomas's land was manufacturing its own wealth. His tomato harvest didn't just grow, it exploded. From 89 pounds to 173, all because of a plant he planted once and never had to touch again. This wasn't magic. It was biological engineering. Beneath the surface, the clover roots were carving out air channels, improving drainage, while inviting an army of earthworms to do the tilling for him. Above ground, the canopy acted as a living mulch, slashing his weeding time by 70% and cutting his water bill nearly in half. It was the perfect system. Zero cost, permanent installation. During the war, this wasn't a secret. It was a duty. Government surveys of thousands of victory gardens proved the data was undeniable. White clover eliminated fertilizer dependency, period. But 1945 changed everything. The war ended and a new industry was born. An industry built on the same factories that once manufactured explosives. They had a problem: you cannot sell fertilizer to people who grow their own nitrogen, so they erased it. By 1946, the gardening guides went silent. The wartime manuals that praised clover pulled from the shelves. University grants for biological research vanished overnight, replaced by checks from chemical giants. Professors who refused to pivot found their offices empty. It was a coordinated, systematic erasure of a plant that worked too well. Here is the clover protocol. They stopped teaching. First, integration. You don't replace your garden, you undersow it. Second, the cycle. Let the clover bloom to attract pollinators, then mow it to release that stored nitrogen back into the earth. Third, observation. Watch the soil structure change as the worm populations return. We were told that modern agriculture required a credit card and a chemical supplier. Thomas Edwards proved we only needed a seed and the truth. They buried the knowledge. It's time we let it grow back. Imagine a weapon of war disguised as a bag of salt sitting in your garage. In 1945, the bombs stopped falling. But the factories didn't stop humming. They just changed the labels. During World War II, the Haber-Bosch process was the engine of destruction. It pulled nitrogen from the air to create explosives. But when peace arrived, the chemical giants faced a catastrophic problem: a surplus of capacity, and no one to kill. They had the infrastructure. They had the stockpiles. They just needed a new market. And they found it. In your backyard. But there was a hurdle. Millions of Americans, people like Thomas Edwards, had spent the war proving they didn't need chemicals. Their victory gardens were thriving on a secret weapon of their own, a small, unassuming plant that fixed nitrogen for free: white clover. You cannot sell fertilizer to people who grow their own, so the industry didn't fight the plant. They erased it. Seed catalogs once filled with clover suddenly went blank. Gardening magazines shifted their tone overnight. They started talking about scientific methods and modern precision. The message was subtle but lethal. Biological was primitive. Chemical was progress. By 1952, the erasure was complete. White clover wasn't banned. It was simply made invisible. Here is the science they buried. Synthetic fertilizer is a chemical dump. It hits the soil like a flood, forcing plants into rapid, weak growth before washing away into our groundwater. It's a drug. And like any drug, it creates dependency. These salts kill the very bacteria and fungi that make soil alive. Once you start, you can't stop, because the biological engine of your land has been murdered. But clover is a master strategist. It fixes between 150 to 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre every single year. It doesn't dump, it drips. As the roots die and decompose, they release nutrients in perfect synchronization with your plant's needs. It feeds the soil biology instead of poisoning it. It is a perpetual motion machine for fertility. If you want to break the cycle of dependency, here is the protocol. First, stop the salts. You cannot heal the soil while you are still poisoning the doctors. Second, reintroduce the seed. Look for white Dutch clover. It's low-growing, resilient, and practically immortal. Third, inoculate. Ensure your seeds are coated with the specific rhizobiobacteria they need to start the nitrogen factory. Finally, mow high. Let the clover bloom. Let it breathe. For 70 years, we've been told that we are the masters of the garden and that nature is just a blank canvas for our chemicals. Thomas Edwards knew better. The survivors of the Great Depression knew better. It's time to stop buying what you can grow. It's time to let the plant work while you sleep. The industrial age of the garden is over. The biological age is waiting under your feet. Every year you are sold a lie in a 50-pound bag. They tell you that without their synthetic inputs, your soil is dead. Your garden is a failure. But between 1942 and 1945, a series of wartime studies uncovered a truth that the billion-dollar fertilizer industry spent the next 80 years trying to bury. Imagine two plots of land, identical, depleted, exhausted. Plot A gets the maximum recommended dose of chemical fertilizer every single year. Plot B. It gets nothing but a handful of white clover seeds. In year 1, the chemicals won. The fertilized plot outproduced the clover by 23%. The industry would have stopped the clock right there. But the researchers kept watching. By year 2, the gap narrowed to 8%. By year 3, the tide turned. The clover plot, the one they said was unfed, outproduced the chemical plot by 11%. And by year 4, the clover plot didn't just win, it dominated. It exceeded the chemical plot by 41%. One side was in a slow, toxic decline. The other was an exploding ecosystem of organic matter, fungal networks, and earthworms. The science was undeniable. Long-term fertility comes from biology, not a factory. So what happened to these studies? They weren't retracted. They weren't disputed. They were simply erased, quietly removed from citations, excluded from research reviews. The science hadn't changed, but the profitable narrative had. You cannot sell fertilizer to people who grow their own nitrogen. But in the 1990s, the secret started leaking out. Farmers began looking at their grandparents' old journals. They saw what happened when they stopped buying the bags. The results matched the 1940s data to the letter. Here's the protocol for the modern rebel. First, stop seeing weeds and start seeing workers. White clover is a foundation species, planted everywhere between your vegetable rows, under your fruit trees, and directly into your lawn. It is a nitrogen factory that works while you sleep. It fixes the soil, increases biological populations, and eliminates the need for synthetic inputs completely. Look at your lawn right now, that low-growing plant with the small white flowers. The one the lawn care companies are paid to kill with poison. That is white clover. It is free nitrogen. It is perpetual fertility. It is practically invisible, growing wild in the face of an industry that wants it dead. They want you dependent. Nature wants you free. Stop killing the solution. 1945. The smoke of World War II clears, but the factories don't stop. They just change targets. They had a problem: massive stockpiles of ammonium nitrate, the same chemical used to level cities. To keep the profits flowing, they rebranded destruction as growth. They turned explosives into fertilizer and told you that your soil was broken without them. But they had to erase the evidence of a better way. Before the chemical boom, every proud lawn and victory garden relied on one plant: white clover. It wasn't a weed, it was the engine. You cannot sell expensive inputs to a man who grows his own nitrogen. And that is exactly why they labeled it an enemy. Look at the irony. We spray toxic herbicides to kill a plant that feeds the soil for free, only to buy synthetic chemicals to replace what we just destroyed. It is a cycle of dependency designed by a boardroom, not by nature. White clover is a biological marvel. While you sleep, it works. Its roots host specialized bacteria that pull nitrogen from the air and inject it directly into the earth. It reduces fertilizer needs by 90%. It stays vibrant green in a scorching drought while the grass around it dies. It demands nothing and gives everything. Thomas Edwards knew this. He saw the shift. He watched as the industry systematically erased the wisdom of generations to protect their bottom line. But the plant didn't disappear. It just waited. If you are ready to break the cycle, here is the protocol for restoring the balance. First, source the raw material. Find untreated, uncoated white clover seeds. Avoid anything touched by fungicides. You only need 1 pound for 4,000 square feet. In early spring, when the soil feels the first hint of warmth, prepare for the broadcast. The seeds are tiny, almost invisible. Mix them with dry sand so you don't dump them all in one spot. Scatter them across the surface. Do not bury them. These seeds crave the light to wake up. Keep the earth moist for 10 days. Once they emerge, let them be. In the first year, don't be aggressive. Let them flower. Let them set seed. You are building a permanent colony, not just a temporary patch. By the second year, the transformation is complete. You will see a rapid, vigorous surge of green. This is the peak of nitrogen fixation. For your garden, plant your vegetables directly into the clover. It acts as a living mulch, suppressing weeds and holding moisture, while manufacturing fertilizer around the clock. If it gets too thick, simply trim it. Leave the clippings where they fall. The roots stay alive. The nitrogen keeps flowing and the cycle continues forever. For your lawn, overseed your existing grass. Within 2 seasons, you will have a self-sustaining ecosystem. Stop the fertilizers. The clover is the factory now. Stop the constant watering. The clover is the reservoir. Stop the herbicides. You are no longer at war with your own land. You were told that a perfect lawn is a chemical one. They lied. A perfect lawn is one that doesn't need a middleman to stay alive. The industry needs your dependency. Nature only needs your permission. Plant the clover. Reclaim your ground. Imagine a factory that never closes. It doesn't require electricity. It doesn't ask for a monthly subscription. It just breathes. Every breath it takes pulls nitrogen from the sky and injects it directly into the earth. It is the perfect biological engine, and it's likely growing in your backyard right now, disguised as a weed. This is the story of how a billion-dollar industry convinced the world to kill the very thing that feeds it. 78% of the air you're breathing is pure nitrogen. Most plants are starving in a sea of plenty because they can't process it. But white clover is different. Through a symbiotic dance with bacteria in its roots, it converts atmospheric gas into liquid gold for the soil. During World War II, this plant was a hero. It was the backbone of the victory gardens that fed a nation. But when the war ended, the massive chemical factories built to create explosives faced a crisis. They had no one to sell their nitrates to, so they pivoted. The explosives became fertilizer, the tanks became tractors, and the narrative shifted. Consider Thomas Edwards. In 1942, he sowed a single handful of white clover seeds across his vegetable patch. He didn't buy a single bag of chemicals for the next 34 years. When he finally sold his home in 1976, the soil was more fertile than the day he started. His neighbors spent decades and thousands of dollars on seasonal inputs. Thomas spent nothing. He had knowledge, they had bills. To protect their new market, the industry had to erase the memory of Thomas Edwards. They rebranded clover as a weed. They engineered herbicides to kill it while leaving grass untouched. They removed it from seed catalogs and replaced it with a dependency model that requires you to pay for what nature used to give for free. If you want to break the cycle, here is the protocol. First, stop the chemical warfare. Broadleaf herbicides are designed to target the very plants your soil needs most. Second, mow high. Keeping your grass at 3 to 4 inches allows clover to shade the soil and thrive. Third, reintroduce the legacy. Scatter white clover seeds in the early spring. It is a one-time investment that pays dividends in nitrogen for decades. Nature provided a system so permanent and so free that it had to be suppressed to maintain a profit stream. That white flower in your lawn isn't a flaw in your landscaping. It's a crack in the wall of an industrial monopoly. It is independence growing in plain sight. We are uncovering the solutions they tried to bury. If you believe this knowledge belongs to the people and not the corporations, subscribe and hit the bell. Share this with someone who is tired of paying for a green lawn. This isn't just about gardening. It's about taking the power back one seed at a time. In 1945, the war ended. But the factories didn't stop. The same assembly lines that churned out ammonium nitrate for explosives suddenly had no target, so they found a new one: your soil. They rebranded the chemistry of destruction as the miracle of modern farming. But to sell a subscription to synthetic nitrogen, they had to kill the competition. They had to erase a plant that had been the backbone of agriculture for centuries. Look at your lawn. Look at the fields. You see a weed. Our grandfathers saw a biological powerhouse. This is the story of the white clover. The plant they spent 70 years making you forget. Nitrogen is all around us. It makes up 78% of the air you're breathing right now. But plants are starving in a sea of plenty. They can't eat atmospheric nitrogen. They need a bridge. The fertilizer industry wants to be that bridge. They want you to buy it bag by bag, season after season. A perpetual debt to the chemical plant. But the white clover does it for free. It hosts a specific bacteria in its roots, rhizobia. These tiny organisms grab nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil. It's a self-sustaining cycle. While you sleep, the clover is manufacturing the highest quality fertilizer known to man, pumping it directly into the root zones of everything growing around it. Thomas Edwards knew this. He wasn't a scientist. He was a man who watched his garden thrive while his neighbor's soil turned to dust. He realized that fertility isn't something you buy, it's something you invite. If you want to break the cycle of dependency, here is the protocol. First, stop the chemicals. Synthetic fertilizers kill the very microbes that make natural nitrogen fixation possible. Second, overseed with white clover. It's low-growing, drought-resistant, and stays green when everything else turns brown. Third, let it flower. Let it establish. Once the clover takes hold, it creates a permanent installation of fertility. You don't need to till it. You don't need to replace it. You just let biology work. You cannot sell a product to someone who grows their own for free. That is why this plant was scrubbed from the labels. That is why it was reclassified as an invader. But the truth is growing in the cracks of the sidewalk. It's waiting in your backyard. One handful of seeds. One decision to step away from the industrial machine. In our next video, we're going deeper into the archives to uncover another wartime secret. A method of pest control that doesn't require a single drop of poison. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The era of dependency is ending one garden at a time. Plant the truth. Share the seed. Your soil is calling.